Calling, 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 calling. Call a growth buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
And welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. This is episode 4. And this is the podcast that is brought to you by the good people at the Growth Busters Project. You can find us at growthbusters.org. I'm Dave Gardner, Chief Growth Buster around here, only because I beat everybody else to the punch. I directed the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth. I also write some media commentary about pro-growth bias in the media, which you can find at growthbiasbusted.org. And I also host another podcast, which is also a radio series, Conversation Earth, and you can learn more about that at conversationearth.org. And I am joined, as usual, by the amazing team, much younger than me.
Yeah, I'm Ben Bacher, and I'm an assistant growth buster. I've been on the team for a couple months now, trying to help out Dave to fight some of the growth bias.
Same. I'm Caitlin. I have worked on Conversation Earth over the summer and done other media-related stuff with Dave. We've made some little videos about population, and yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Today, I really want to mention Conversation Earth, the other podcast that we work on, Caitlin and I do. It's really an amazing show. I guess you could call the Growth Busters podcast maybe the advanced podcast, and Conversation Earth is more for a wider audience and people who might be a little bit in earlier stages of sustainability awareness. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think so. Conversation Earth also is really different because we interview so many thought leaders, and hopefully we'll do more of that on Growth Busters, but right now it's just the humble three of us. So
yeah, so you may decide that you get more expertise here, or you may decide you get more expertise there. And actually, even advanced growth busters really like to listen to Conversation Earth, and I get nothing but the most amazing, glowing praise from everyone about that show, which makes me think we must continue producing episodes of Conversation Earth. What is not telling me that is you out there in podcast land so far haven't stepped up fully to fund season 3. We're in the middle of crowdfunding for Conversation Earth. We need to raise $20,000, which isn't that much, when you consider that we have a national, if not a global audience. In fact, it is a global audience. We get fan mail from Australia and the United Kingdom. And really, we are talking to the leading thinkers on the planet about human civilization, the way we behave. Are we behaving in a way where we're going to survive? Are we behaving in a way that's fair to other species? Are we behaving in a way that's fair to future generations? Very, very important work. And so we just need everybody to pitch in a little bit to get us to the $20,000 mark so that season 3 actually happens. We finished our 43rd episode. We've got to keep it up, but we can't do it if we don't have the money to cover the expenses. So I encourage you to visit tinyurl.com/CE season 3, and that's the number 3. Right. And I wanted to invite you to comment, Caitlin. You and I hadn't had a chance to talk very much about my latest brainstorm, which I just unleashed on the world last week, which is we've started to confirm more and more of our guests for season 3, and we are offering those episodes up for people to actually underwrite.
Yes, I'm so excited about that. I'm so excited about the lineup that you have for season 3 so far, particularly Daniel Quinn and Peter Singer are 2 thinkers who I've followed for a really long time, and I would love to hear their interviews. So I hope that people fund them because I can't. But I think that it's a really incredible lineup, and those voices are worth funding.
Yeah, I somehow wisely, or maybe not so wisely, put Richard Heinberg at the top of the list. I did get him confirmed, and boom, only 4 people can underwrite each episode because we don't want people to have to listen for a long time while we name the underwriters. And that's what happens if you adopt one of these episodes, then we will say on all the radio stations that carry it and to all the podcast listeners in gyms and on trains everywhere, we will say this episode was made possible by Ben Bacher or John Doe or whoever. And so within 8 hours of announcing that, we already had 3 underwriters for the Richard Heinberg show. He's a no-brainer. He's very, very popular. But as you mentioned, really incredible thinkers like Daniel Quinn, Carolyn Baker, And we're going to, hopefully each week we'll be adding names as we get more people confirmed. Had an interesting email exchange with Daniel Quinn, and he's not going to be early in the season because he is finishing a book.
Ooh.
So we have another book to look forward to from Daniel Quinn, so that's good.
That's exciting.
But he said the minute he can get out from under that deadline, he's all in.
Woohoo.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
Okay, so enough about us. Let's talk about the world, shall we?
Yes.
First up on my list is hurricanes. Boy, we've had some doozies. In fact, it's just been one after another, and in fact, they don't even wait their turn anymore, do they? A lot of storms, and of course, we all know by now that climate change is playing a role in that.
Right.
Fair to say, and the scientists are talking about that too, that we've got warmer seas, and that they've been telling us that that's going to create more tropical storms and hurricanes and the like, and increase their severity. And so we're definitely witnessing that this year. And but there's kind of another interesting angle, which really kind of surprised me to see these news stories. I don't know if you guys were as surprised as I was. But first we had Harvey in Houston. And before that was even over, there was an NPR report and a couple of news stories about how Houston was just set up to be a hurricane disaster because it's just paved. It's just
right.
Thousands and thousands of square miles of pavement, and it's in Texas where they're a little less likely to want to regulate development to begin with. They kind of like to have a small government as much as possible. And, developers rule the roost almost everywhere anyway. But in Texas, they rule the roost even more than most. And so not as much green space, not as many detention ponds, and a lot more impervious surfaces. So there was nowhere for all that water to go. And so there were a couple of news stories that crossed my desk about that. One was, this was in the New York Times. A storm forces Houston, the limitless city, to consider its limits. The story starts off with the story of how a pair of New York real estate speculators founded Houston on the banks of a torpid bayou in the 1830s. And shortly after they founded it, every home and every business flooded. And in fact, they had 16 major floods in the first century for Houston, and it really hasn't stopped. But it hasn't stopped them from continuing to pave over the prairie and the grasslands and all of what Mother Nature put there, which was working quite fine, thank you,
right.
Before we got there.
I was surprised by that. I feel like when I think about preserving natural spaces, I don't usually think about it in terms of natural disasters. I just think about it in terms of beauty, and I wasn't thinking about all of the water that can get absorbed by grasses and wetlands. So that gave me a new angle to think about pavement from.
Yeah,
something else to think about. And that especially demonstrated in Florida, like the Everglades. The Army Corps of Engineers for years, was trying to re-engineer the Everglades, and they did nothing but screw everything up. Mother Nature had a pretty good system. And before we start developing cities on the coast, most of the coastlines have natural defenses.
Right.
And we've taken them away. Now, we know better now, fortunately. And I think the temptation would be to read a story like this New York Times story about Houston and say, okay, well, they just needed to do it differently. There's nothing wrong with putting millions of people right there in the, on that low land, but they should have had more regulation and done it more carefully. And certainly, if they were going to do it, they should have done that. And I want to talk about that for a second. But the truth is, I think at some point we might have to just ask the question, does it even make any sense? How valuable is a prosperity strategy of endless population growth if every 6 or 8 years somebody's got to spend billions of dollars repairing all the damage from a storm?
So that makes me think of a question. So obviously, ideally, we wouldn't have that many people, and then Houston wouldn't have this problem to begin with. But suppose all these people exist already. Where do you think it's more ideal to relocate them to more sustainable places as opposed to somewhere that's so susceptible to natural disasters?
No, just anywhere that I'm not. Just kidding. Well, let's go ahead and plunge into that since you brought that up. We pretty well know it's the same deal in Florida.
Right.
Same deal.
Right.
So we don't need to really belabor that. So we've got coastal cities that in two areas, and there are others who for over a century we've known really it was kind of foolish to put people there, but we kept on putting people there anyway, even though we knew these disasters were going to happen and we experienced them and then we soon forgot about them. Well, let's think about what other kind of disasters there are. I'm thinking about water in the American Southwest, which we talked about in a previous episode. You know, we have these major droughts from time to time. We've got these huge population centers like Phoenix growing rampantly, Las Vegas, Southern California, where they're growing and they're still hell-bent to grow, even though you can't even put a routine number on it, but every few years or every decade, there's a new drought. And the chances are we're going to have never-ending drought going forward. And so that seems to me like that's a silly place to have a lot more people. If you can't stop people from making babies, then you've got to find a place to put them. I think it's not that smart to put them in Houston or in Florida or put them in Phoenix or Las Vegas. And it seems to me like there was one other way where nature was saying, not here. Oh, wildfires. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Today, everybody loves to live in the woods or near the woods. Guilty. I couldn't tell you the number of trees on the lot right here next to our house. We're in an area where we're really in significant fire danger. And every summer, throughout the West here in the U.S., they are fighting wildfires, and they have to fight them vigorously because there's just this huge urban forest interface where homes would be lost if the fires were allowed to burn. So not exactly laid right over where the drought danger is, but also in the American West.
Right.
Not necessarily that smart either.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of an aside and isn't necessarily all that relevant to growth, but I took a class on community forestry, and they were discussing that part of the reason why Colorado is so susceptible to forest fires is because naturally the Colorado forest isn't that dense, but when settlers came to Colorado from the east, in the east, a healthy forest is a forest chock full of trees, and so they kind of imposed that idea on Colorado forests, and so now our forests are much denser and much more susceptible to wildfires, which I thought was just an interesting little...
Once we start building structures in the forest, we can't let the fires burn, and fires were one of nature's way of thinning the forest.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So my comments about the building in Houston, the building in Florida, and it's going to go right on. You know, they're going to put everything back exactly where it was. They're probably going to try to be a little bit smarter about it. But it happened in the first place because developers rule. Developers have figured out how to make sure that they control the local policymakers, and they make sure that city councils and board of county commissioners are people who are indebted to them in some way, maybe not quite overtly corrupt way, but you can't help but want to help the people who help you get elected. Let's just say that.
Right.
But also the developers have a good way of making sure that the spin machine stays in business, which keeps us buying this myth that we get prosperity from growth, that growth is good. That if you're against growth, you're against prosperity, you're against jobs. And that keeps us addicted to growth. No one ever subtracts the billions in storm damage when they're talking about the glorious economic benefits of growth or some future growth project. They never subtract the billions that we're having to spend now to repair the storm damage. That's just considered, that's off the books. That's an aberration. It's not a cost of growth. And it's easy to do that because who's paying for that? Really, in these cases of these storms, the taxpayers of the United States, all over the United States, are paying really kind of a growth subsidy. We're paying for the temporary and short-sighted economic prosperity that these communities gained by ignoring the rules of nature.
It's also like who benefits, who gets the money from coming back in and rebuilding everything.
So true.
Yeah. So they don't really pay a price at all, do they? Also, I think it's an example where we can't see the forest for the trees because people, like I mentioned, people are going to think we just needed to grow Houston and Florida differently rather than admitting that putting the population there was probably crazy to begin with, but definitely growing the population there. Now that we know how dangerous it is, it seems pretty silly. And even Scientific American got into the game, and there was a story there called Hurricane Irma Florida's overdevelopment has created a ticking time bomb. I want to give you a quick quote from this. Climate change is affecting our hazards, but at the same time, society has also increased its ability to be harmed by a hazard as well. So these two issues are coming together more and more often, resulting in disasters like we've seen with Irma and Harvey, and out west with the wildfires. So kudos to Annie Sneed for seeing that connection. And besides the myth, this myth of prosperity from growth, there are a number of analysts out there who we'll talk about a little bit today who have done the research to really kind of prove that it is a myth and that we really don't have that prosperity. But besides that, well, the mythology extends further. It's not just that there's prosperity, but it's success. We've come to equate growth with success. It's become a metric. You might be the mayor of a city that isn't growing and everybody's happy as a clam. But you won't be, because every year the U.S. Census Bureau is going to come out with a new report and it's going to rank which cities are the fastest growing. And if you're not near the top of that list, you're just not considered successful. How crazy is that?
That is crazy. I think it's one of those unspoken, just cultural codes that we don't think about, like that growth is a metaphor for success. Growth isn't inherently successful, but it is in the English language in the U.S., and that's just a weird thing to think about.
It's true. It really has gone beyond, I don't know which one was first, but it has gone beyond economic growth and growth of your city, growth of your state. It's gotten to where, we talk about personal growth. Mm-hmm. And personal growth is good.
Right.
It's unfortunate that we used that word growth. And so I hear it all the time as a growth buster. People are always coming up to me and saying, can't you just be for smart growth, or can't you just be against urban growth or something like that? But you can't just be against growth because there's so many good things that grow. We want our plants to grow. We want our crops to grow. We want personal growth. And I just think people are smart enough that they can figure out what kind of growth we're busting, but maybe not.
It's weird that it's become so convoluted. Those things contradict each other. If you want plant growth, you probably shouldn't want as much population growth, but that word has been commandeered.
Yeah, when we don't do that calculus, think about that. There was a really great piece in Governing Magazine about what makes cities thrive and what makes cities think they're thriving.
It's basically talking with mayors of several cities and looking at numbers of, they publish the list of the cities that have the biggest growth, and it's a very competitive list, and every mayor wants to be at the top of the list. Or not every mayor, but many mayors do. They're kind of discussing why that's so, and they proposed one option is because it means more voters, and for the mayors, that's a good thing, and if you're getting people to come to the city, it's probably a pretty good sign that you're going to get reelected, which I thought was pretty interesting. But one thing that I found particularly interesting was, I think it might have been Detroit, but a city that saw a decrease in growth, and it actually benefited a lot. But it was interesting to see that one reason they were proposing for this was because largely the people who had left the city were largely African American people, and they were replaced by white people. And so that this gentrification that just from our anti-growth perspective, even just necessarily if there's a decrease in growth, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing or a sustainable thing. And I found that was kind of an interesting point in the article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you brought that one up because it really raises two issues. One is the gentrification made the kind of the typical metrics, other than population growth, by all other metrics, it seemed like the city was doing well because its economy was getting bigger, incomes were rising. But sadly, diversity was declining, and it wasn't like life wasn't getting better for the African American community.
Right.
They were being chased out of their homes, and that, it's kind of hard to celebrate that particular.
Right. I think that plays into the thing that you were talking about, how do we define what is successful and what is a successful city? If we look at average income and say that if the average per capita income of a city is really high, and that's how we define success, then we're going to be excluding so many people. So yeah, I just think that that's another example of a myth.
Right.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you brought that up because, first of all, I do want to really congratulate J.B. Wogan, who wrote this story in Governing Magazine. The headline is, "Population Growth Means a City is Thriving." Or does it? And the subhead is, "Public officials and reporters alike adopt the myth that bigger is better." That's not always the case. So this reporter did a great job of digging deeper and asking all the right questions, but you could still see that even when he kind of busted it, when he found a city where the population growth wasn't that substantial or it wasn't happening at all, he found other ways that the city was successful, but they were still archaic metrics like, rising income.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Maybe this is a new thought to you that rising income wouldn't be a good success metric. Most people think rising income. Who wouldn't want that? Well, it would be nice to have, but is that sustainable? Truthfully, especially if you have 7.6 billion people on the planet, can you have 7.5 billion or more people on the planet and they all expect ever rising income and you think you're going to have anything left to work with even in 200 or 300 years, let alone 1,000 years? It's just not sustainable unless you take off for other planets to plunder. You can't have perpetually rising income. So he sort of busted the myth, which was nice, but he busted it with metrics that were, and probably wisely, with metrics that would still speak to most people.
Right.
Well, and it's an interesting question of how do we measure what we're looking to measure? Is it happiness, or just because I was looking at some alternative metrics to like GDP and income that have been proposed, or like the prosperity index, but I'm looking at what's included in the prosperity index. And it's based on a variety of factors, including wealth, economic growth. Those are the first two: education, health, personal well-being, and quality of life. But it's just so interesting that it's like those two of wealth and economic growth are so baked into it.
You would think we would prioritize health and personal well-being and quality of life. Those seem like good metrics for me. And inclusion.
Right. I wonder if there's a way, if you could take that prosperity index and separate out economic growth and wealth and just do because you think if you have a population that's educated, healthy, and personally well, has a good quality of life, what more
do you need?
Does it matter if they're really rich or not? I don't know.
That's the American dream.
That reminds me of my interview with Rex Weiler that's available on Conversation Earth, where Rex was one of the founders of Greenpeace International and a great environmental journalist, and really just a charming interview. And he said, "I don't care whether my kids have more money and can consume more than me."
Do people really believe that the only way people achieve happiness is by consuming something? I mean, I'm happiest when I'm doing nothing. I'm happiest when I'm hanging out with my family, sitting on the back porch playing my guitar.
If you listen to the Growth Busters podcast on a regular basis, it will sink in rapidly rather than slowly that we're trying to push the world toward the kind of metrics that you talked about, Ben, where we're not thinking so much about wealth and padding our pocketbook. I like to characterize it as needs met. Economic growth is just a fool's mission. It's so sad that right now we're hearing so much about how a new health care bill could be paid for and tax cuts could be paid for with economic growth. That is the lazy, easy thing for politicians to say is we're just going to grow the economy. We don't have to really be that smart. We can cut these other programs, or we can afford these programs and just count on restoring robust economic growth, even though if they ever took an ecological economics course or listened to the Herman Daly episode of Conversation Earth, they would start to get a different perspective about the fact that the world economy cannot grow forever, and it's already bigger than the planet can support. So we've got to get over the idea that expanding an economy it just can't be on our list at all. It's got to be, what is the purpose of an economy? Right. What do you think the purpose of an economy is, Ben?
To serve its people.
Meet their needs, right?
Yeah.
Security, roof over your head, food on your plate.
But you're right, it's really the other way now. It's like the people are here to serve the economy.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to talk about, when we think about growing the economy, what we're really talking about is growing the economy at someone's expense. So growing the economy in specific areas in the U.S. at the expense of other people in other parts of the world, or people in parts of the U.S. too.
I think unless you view it as that there's an infinite amount of growth potential we have. Because I agree that if it's a zero-sum game, if we're growing, we're taking it from someone. But I feel like some people believe that there's no no end to the potential we could grow to. I don't know.
Right.
I thought it was interesting too. I just looked up I've mentioned it before on the Bhutan. Their main indicator of success instead of GDP is gross national happiness.
Yeah.
And so I was just looking at what factors into the construction of that. And it's so interesting because number 1 is psychological well-being. 2 is health, education, time use, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, and the last one is living standards. And
that sounds incredible.
Yeah, I guess economic well-being would be factored into living standards, and it's implicitly in a lot of those categories, but I just think it's so cool that there's no one thing that's saying like we just have to get the economy big for the sake of I don't know,
and that psychological well-being is on top of the list because that's not a thing that we care about at all in the US.
But it is interesting that living standards is on the list because that's another one of our assumptions that I think works against us. Is we've right now in the overdeveloped world there is this assumption that our standard of living should improve year after year after year. And I suppose if we were to redefine standard of living, maybe that would be a good goal. But the current definition is how cushy is your life? You know, how much, how powered is it? I don't know. But I hadn't even thought to look up the definition. What's the official definition of
living standards? Because we just assume that's such an assumed term. Yeah.
Yeah. But basically, most people, if we went and did, and we should do a man and woman on the street YouTube video about this sometime, I think, where we talk to people about that and see what they think. What does standard of living mean?
Right.
And
like what your ideal.
Yeah. And what do you want to improve? You know, do you think, are you entitled to an ever improving standard of living? If so, what do you want to be improved next year? What's the answer going to be? I want a robot that vacuums my house so that I can sit in my chair and watch more TV. I want a bigger screen TV. I want colder air conditioning.
Well, yeah, it'd be interesting to do that, or even just to ask, what are your personal goals? Well, what do you want to see in the next 5 years for yourself, and see what people say, and see if we can kind of pull out some implicit growth things in that, because I imagine a lot of people would want like a better job or like I don't know, and maybe I'm just being
or to save money for family,
for college, or I don't know.
But I was thinking you might get better, that question, you might get better answers that are closer to their soul, that are the kind of things where. But if you didn't start out with standard of living, but you started out by saying, what do you want to do with your life? What would you like your life to be like in a year or two? You might be more inclined to talk about the things that really matter, that aren't so materialistic and consumption oriented.
Well, and it just makes it like they're just. I think that even with the three of us, I think they're so like growth is so, and economic prosperity is so baked into our mentality. Like I just had a story from like a week ago. We just went to this store, Banana Republic, and we were just kind of trying on suits just for fun. Just I wasn't actually going to buy a suit, but one of my friends was like saying that it was like amazing how someone who's like not all that growth oriented but was like found it very attractive that like of suits, I don't know. And it was just interesting because in the movies and everything we see, it's like that's what is attractive, someone who's
wealthy.
Wealthy, and I don't know.
So it was the suit itself. It wasn't just like shopping therapy that they were enjoying. It was that they actually liked the idea. Yeah. Okay. Because gosh, there's nothing more uncomfortable to wear than a suit.
Well, I actually thought it was actually comfortable for me. But I was wearing it for 5 minutes literally in the changing room.
Yeah. Try it for a day. Try it on a hot day for a day. I don't even own a suit anymore. There was a day when I owned like 4 suits. And I even kept track of which suit I wore to which luncheon so that I wouldn't repeat the same suit, 2 months in a row. And, because obviously I was caring about that kind of stuff. And now I go to events occasionally that probably a lot of people would wear suits too. I don't have a suit to wear. I get to be a whole lot more comfortable.
Right.
Embarrass my mother from time to time.
Well, and I don't know. It's just kind of been... I've been kind of going through an interesting like mental journey recently about just thinking about we're seniors in college, and so I've been thinking about jobs and stuff, and I feel like I've always said I would never have a job where I have to wear a suit every day, but I didn't really think about it seriously until recently. just thinking about like why I would want to do that and thinking about other options. I don't know. I thought it was interesting that you just assume when you graduate from college, you have to go live in a different city and get a new house or a new apartment. And I don't know. It's interesting dealing with that growth bias in yourself. I don't know.
So how much does a good suit cost?
I'd guess, I don't know, $800, $1,000.
Okay, I'm impressed that you're in the ballpark. I mean, you can certainly get a wearable suit for $400, but if you're working on Madison Avenue or Wall Street, you're talking about $1,500 suits and up.
Can people tell that?
Yeah, some
That's
people
crazy.
can. The people
That blows my mind.
the people that you might not really want to impress can tell that.
Right.
But just think about that. Think about what else you could do with that money. And,
Right.
and when you own that suit, then you have to dry clean it. And how awesome is dry cleaning for the planet? Not to mention your pocketbook. I think that would be probably low on the list of lightening the load and improving the world things. But I'd love to just outlaw suits altogether. They are just dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting intersections too with, maybe we should talk about this in a different show sometime, but with sort of masculinity and what we've taught are the standards for like being a successful man in the US and growth, because I feel like those two things are so connected. You're a successful man if you can afford a suit and if you have a really high paying job to support a growing family and a car and travel, and yeah, it's all about what you can consume.
So true, so true. I remember thinking when I bought a house with a 3-car garage, I thought I had arrived.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to undo that, to try to deconstruct that within yourself, because it's so built into every
Yeah,
aspect
super
of our
pervasive.
society.
Yeah, like if you just look at all the media of like all the movies, what successful men are. Wolf of Wall Street. I don't know. Like,
Maybe it helps to kind of somehow find a way to control what you consume in that department. I had never really thought about this, but I lived in my younger days when I was in my 20s. I lived in kind of an inner city neighborhood that was really pretty diverse and exciting and interesting. But a few blocks away was one of the wealthiest parts of town. And whenever I went running or walking for exercise, I went straight to that neighborhood and walked down these streets with these massive mansions and huge lawns, and I just drooled. I mean, I was, I would have 45 minutes or an hour of envy and think, wow, what do I need to do to live in one of these cool places one of these days? How cool would it be to have a party in one of these houses? And, if you do that, you're sinking yourself.
Right.
Somehow, fortunately, I ended up moving away from that and eventually got unplugged from that. But yeah, I don't know. You must suspect that maybe somebody kidnapped me in the middle of the night and deprogrammed me so that I would become the guy that made the Growthbusters movie that says, man, we don't need that.
It's probably pretty obvious, but I was just looking at the list of the world's most powerful people from Forbes, and obviously they're all super wealthy, like Bill Gates and Ben Bernanke, but it's just so interesting to think about this connection of like power and economic success, and like if you don't have economic success, you'd never even be considered for the list of these people. I don't know.
Even the way that it ties to, if you're supposed to be a wealthy man, like that's also way that you're able to obtain a woman too, and how women are taught to feed into that by wanting to depend on someone who is really wealthy. And
yeah, because even in my family, we would joke about like one of my sisters, like if she wanted to be rich, like marrying a Russian oil person or something, but they'd never joke about me marrying a wealthy, I don't know, Russian oil woman.
Right.
Fortunately, I think we're making a lot of progress away from that mythology, fortunately, but still got a ways to go, I think.
Long ways to go.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to give short shrift to this Governing magazine story because the guy really refers to some interesting case studies and some interesting studies, and if you visit growthbusters.org and go to the blog, we'll post links to these studies and these stories so that you can explore them more deeply than we have time to here. But I do want to get into a little bit. And one thing, I've got a great paragraph here that I highlighted. Most journalists and academics tend to accept the arguments in favor of population growth as the most important thing, or sometimes the only thing. And mayors and civic groups can reinforce that mindset. Oh, yes, they can. But the truth is that the health of a city may not be tied so intrinsically to the ebb and flows of its population. I thought that was just a really great setup, and it made me hunger for more from this story. And the author goes on, well, you mentioned this, I think, Caitlin, adding people means expanded workforce, new residents mean new customers for local businesses, which in turn increases tax revenue. With more tax revenue, cities can invest more in roads, public transit, schools, the arts, and parks. And, we see that hope even in here in Colorado Springs where we are today, is there's always this hope that some big company will move into town and they will donate a lot of money so that our museums are bigger and better, and the homeless are better fed and all of this stuff. There's always some external factor that we're hoping for. And certainly that's how the developers always sell every project, is look at the economic impact of this. Look at the tax.
How many jobs we'll create.
Yeah. But my experience from observing this very closely for a long time here in Colorado Springs and reading about it and studying about it all over the U.S. at least, is that there's so much evidence that that doesn't work. Because, name one growing city where the traffic actually gets better. The increased tax revenue is never enough just to keep them from losing ground on traffic congestion alone. Usually also losing ground on air quality. Schools usually getting more crowded. Rarely do the schools get less crowded. And the tax rate always goes up, never goes down. So empirically, it's pretty easy to bust that myth and disprove it. But J.B. Wogan went further than that, and he looked at a couple of people that you may want to Google who have looked into it a little bit more deeply. One of them is Eben Fodor, who appears in the Growthbusters documentary and wrote the book Better, Not Bigger. Eben is in Eugene, Oregon. He's a community planning consultant. Wise communities all over the U.S. hire him to do economic impact studies and cost of growth studies. And I think the communities that hire him are more progressive-minded. I don't think you'll ever find a real estate developer hiring Eben Fodor, because he wrote the book Better, Not Bigger, and he tends to look a little bit more deeply to really parse out the real costs and benefits. And he doesn't buy the myth that growth is going to be profitable. He knows better. And, of course, no developer wants that. So developers will always find an economist somewhere who can be bought, who will, hate to say it, but really cherry-pick the data a little bit. They may not really intentionally do it, but they know where their bread is buttered.
Right.
Backtracking a little bit, before we get to Eben, there was a gentleman named Paul Gottlieb, an economist, believe it or not, at Rutgers University. And he had argued for decades that local elected officials should take a measured approach to growth, that metropolitan areas with stable or slow-growing populations are likely to have greater economic prosperity. Yoo-hoo. Good for him. So he published a paper quite a while back, 15 years ago, called Growth Without Growth, and he called attention to 23 of the largest 100 metro areas, which he nicknamed wealth builders. And these were places with below average increases in population, but above average increases in per capita income. So there's that old metric, unfortunately, but it's a better metric than population growth anyway.
Yeah.
And then he also found areas that he called population magnets that had really excelled at gaining residents, but they performed way below average at increasing per capita income. So he kind of broke that relationship between population growth and prosperity. So Paul Gottlieb and Growth Without Growth, you may want to Google if you want to dig a little bit deeper. So in 2012, Fodor did a similar analysis with more recent data and published an article in Economic Development Quarterly. He compared annual population growth with 3 economic indicators: per capita income, poverty, and unemployment. And among the 100 largest metro areas, the faster growing cities were associated with lower incomes, greater income declines, and more people in poverty. the 25 slowest growing areas outperformed the 25 fastest growing areas across all three measures. So,
but it's interesting. Those two things also make me think about what, and I'm not sure how conscious this is, but when the mayors say that they want growth, what they don't really want is growth of poor people. They want growth of wealthy people.
Right.
Because I think that seems pretty clear that no mayor wants an influx of new poor people to come into their city, whereas if you get a growth of people who are already wealthy, that seems like a pretty beneficial thing.
Yeah, but if you had poor people, your goal would be for them to move out of poverty.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But it seems like in a lot of cases, it ends up being that the goal is to get poor people to move out of your city, not out of poverty.
Right.
So I feel like those metrics are good for getting rid of that bias that growth is always better in the terms that people think of it in, but we need to get rid of those terms.
Yeah. It's a step in the right direction. It's talking the language that your audience understands. That makes it helpful.
Well, and it's also interesting to me that it makes sense, but the privileging of the urban only, that we're only talking about cities. And I'm just interested in, I guess it's harder to gather data for like more rural regions, but it just makes me think about where people go. I don't know what percentage of the U.S. lives in an urban area, but there's a pretty significant percentage that lives outside of urban.
Yeah, but that's shrinking. People are moving to cities in droves.
Right.
Although
Right.
Richard Heinberg predicts that will reverse at some point,
Interesting.
which would be good.
It would be good.
Why?
Yeah, I feel like it has to. Reading about how so many more young people are moving to townhouses and cities and not having kids. And I was just thinking about who is going to farm. If everyone moves to the cities, who is going to create all of the things that people like about cities, who is going to sustain those and make it so people can still eat. And
They're going to have vertical farms on the sides of the skyscrapers, Caitlin.
That's interesting because I'd heard before the ecological argument for cities. I don't know.
what is it?
That if you took all the people in cities and spread them all throughout in much less dense areas for a variety of reasons, it would like create more ecological harm, just because having people like densely packed into one area allows you to have more resources around the city that would be, and also because like delivering resources to that, you only have to deliver it to one specific area.
But I think the issue ends up being that there aren't people creating those resources in the first place.
Right.
People just want to be able to... It's nice that people can walk to grocery stores that are maybe more centralized with a lot of people around them. But if no one is growing the food...
Right.
And no one...
So I guess it's a balance.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, you brought up something that is one of my kind of pet peeves, because there are certainly a lot of environmental progressives who just think that big cities are such a huge blessing. And there's some of the advantages are, well, you pack people close together. They're all sharing walls, so you're not spending nearly as much energy heating and cooling places than you are if everybody has an individual dwelling unit. And obviously there's the economies of scale for mass transit, and people can walk. You can have a grocery store on every block in New York City because you've got so many people packed there. But on the other hand, you do have some significant energy expend and carbon footprint on getting the food transported in there.
Especially when the food is... When you look at where food actually comes from, like the fact that we import so much of our food in ways that make so little sense. Like, it would be great if cities were centered around agriculture and everything was actually localized. It's just not.
But for me, I wonder, would there not be a greater expenditure of energy if you took everyone in New York City and spread them out and then had to deliver the food individually to many different...
Yeah, there probably would be. But I wonder if it would be more efficient if they were spread out into villages,
right?
And they were all growing their own food.
Yes,
right.
I agree with that.
Right around that village.
Yeah.
And another benefit would be they would actually see nature from time to time, and then they might appreciate it.
Right.
Because you live in a big city, you forget nature even exists.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of forest bathing?
No.
Yeah, there's this thing called forest bathing, and people will teach you how to do it, where you go into the woods and you just sit and you just soak it up.
AKA my childhood.
Maybe, yeah. There's all these, mental and spiritual benefits of just, getting back to nature and getting away from the hustle and bustle and the stress and the noise pollution and all of that. And there may be some other chemical things about being in the middle of all of that flora that
I can see
benefit
that
you.
completely, that disconnect. Like if you work on Wall Street and all you do every day is commute from your apartment on 6th Ave to Wall Street, you don't see a single tree all day, and it like that just is life. There's nothing else.
Yeah, and if you have a kid and you ask that kid, where does broccoli come from? The freezer section, that whole paycheck.
I feel like that's how I thought about food, and I grew up in a place where I was surrounded by forests, but I didn't learn anything about farming when I was little, and that was totally my impression of the grocery store. Like, Oreos come from little Oreo packages that are just always there.
Yeah. And so there's something to be said for knowing more about intimately where it comes from and caring about it. And, the whole big city thing, I think, really sort of drives industrialized agriculture. It just turns it into this factory supply chain. And we've, and just for so many reasons, we've got to get away from that and get more human hands involved in growing the food. So we do need some people out there. But unfortunately, rural communities are really struggling with no jobs other than farming, and people aren't paying enough for food to. It's hard to make a living as a farmer today.
Really hard. You have to invest so much of your own money up front, and then you don't know how much of a return you'll get based on so many factors, from weather, and climate change isn't helping with that, to you don't know how much people are going to buy because they're not investing their own money up front in their food.
Yeah, so it's tricky. So it's interesting. So this deruralization and urbanization, I guess, actually kind of came into play in a story that the BBC did recently that caught my eye about a little mountain village of Kalatinzi, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, in western Bulgaria, where they say there's no shop, there's no school, there's no bus service. But until a few decades ago, 600 people lived here. But now most of the houses are empty, and they're down to, 19 people or something like that. And so this whole story is about this population shrinkage disaster. And that caught my eye because most of the time I try to call out any kind of shrinking population disaster story as ridiculous, because it would be good news if population was shrinking everywhere. We would be actually moving towards sustainability. But the truth is that you've got people and you've got infrastructure in place, and it is going to be a little bit painful.
Right.
And it can be a lot painful if you go from 600 people down to 20. That's pretty hard to do. But all these cities, I would advise them when they call me and ask me to come in and consult for them on their growth strategies. And so far, no one has.
They're coming.
My fee will be very minimal. But I would advise them. I would say, world population is not going to keep on growing. It cannot. Population growth is going to come to an end. It will be better for us if it happens sooner rather than later. But even if you're not interested in leading the charge, you're eventually going to be competing with other cities for population growth in a world where the supply is shrinking.
Right.
And what that means is that you may invest millions and millions of dollars in building up infrastructure that then is going to become stranded assets. It's going to be unneeded. Like Detroit kind of went through. You will have houses that no one wants to buy, no one needs. You'll have buildings that are unoccupied. So wouldn't it be wise to kind of get ahead of the game and think more long term and say, okay, we don't want to be fighting over scraps. We want to be the next big thing, or the next little thing, I guess I should say.
Right.
Yeah, so what would make a healthy local economy in a world with a shrinking population? Wow, how many city leaders are asking that kind of question? But that's the kind of question that really needs to be asked. And I think you can start getting good answers if you know what the purpose of an economy is, and that is to meet people's needs. You don't lament so much the fact that if you have fewer workers in 10 years, that's okay as long as you can meet the needs of the number of workers you have.
Right. And I think about how many practical skills I don't have in terms of if we were to really localize our economies. Growing food is a great example. I don't know how to farm, and I don't know how to
repair a toaster.
I don't know how to repair a toaster.
No one does. No one does.
Right. I depend on these huge systems that I assume will always be there for so many little aspects of my life. And I just think about when those crumble, inevitably, what will happen?
Yeah. Truly successful cities of the 21st century are the ones that are asking those kind of questions. And there are not very many of them because, unfortunately, the officials are elected by
Right.
the guys in the suits at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon every month.
It's brought up a question to me of like, if you wanted to vote this way, how to vote, just because I imagine the development lobbyists give pretty equally to Republicans and Democrats. I don't think it's necessarily a one-party issue.
No, it's so not.
And if you look at the candidates for that they're proposing for the Democratic Party for the primary in 2020, a lot of them have big, like Kamala Harris has big Wall Street ties, and almost all of them are pretty big tied into the growth bias. So I'm just wondering how we can vote. I guess the Green Party maybe? I don't know. I'm interested in what your thoughts are on.
Good question. Even the Green Party won't really talk about population growth because of the population taboo.
Right.
They are a step in the right direction in so many ways, but not 100% there. If you're really looking for a true sustainability party, they're not it.
Well, and it just makes me think it's kind of depressing just because the way that our political system is set up, where you essentially need money to compete. And you get money from the capitalist system, and what we're advocating is essentially a reversal of the goals of the capitalist system. So no one would give any candidate money. I don't know.
Yep.
Yeah. And you see that happen. Well, Colorado Springs, we elected earlier this year our most progressive council ever, probably, where we actually have a majority on council who are brighter and more enlightened than most. And the people who the developers backed in that election, they all lost.
Really?
You can bet, I can assure you that in 2 years, when the next city election happens, that the developers will spend whatever it takes to get control back of the city council. That's what I've read. That happens in every community. They usually don't let control slip out of their grasp, but whenever they do, they regain control very quickly. I had a number of other really great things to talk about. But
sounds about right.
Time flies. So should we, do you have any final thoughts before we move on to lightening the load?
I'm just excited for future episodes.
Yeah, I just had a thought for a future episode about how automation and I think that's going to be a huge issue over the next 20, 25 years, how that would affect population growth and the economy, and I don't know. I thought that could be an interesting topic.
All right, let's put that on our list, because I know we just sit around scratching our heads saying, God, there's nothing to talk about. What can we talk about this time? Never happens. Every episode, each of the three of us share something that we do that we think is kind of interest to shrink our footprint on the planet, leave something for other species or for future children of the world.
I guess I'll go first, and I guess this is kind of different from the ones I've talked about before, and it's related a little bit to what I was talking about earlier on in the episode. But I was talking with my parents recently about, I was feeling some anxiety about what I was going to do after I graduate college, and I feel like I have this bachelor's degree, and I have to go out to a new city, and I was thinking about all these different cities and get an apartment and live by myself and do all these things. And then I just realized that, and I'm not committed to this, but that you can always live at home with my parents already have a house, and there's an extra room in that house. And I live in Santa Cruz, so it's a pretty cool place. And there's work I can do there. And I think that's actually a pretty significant impact you can have on many different things. And it's very un-American kind of to think, because I at least feel like you have to be moving on and moving out from your parents, and that's kind of a metric of success. But that was something I've been thinking about, that I think if you think about that as an option, it's actually pretty both financially and sustainably wise, a good option.
So Mr. and Mrs. Bacher, change the locks now. You've been warned.
No, they're actually fully on board. I'm not committed to that, but I think it's just an option that, like, I think almost very few of my friends at school think about that, because it's just not American.
Yeah.
And I think about how in the U.S., I think we have a loneliness crisis too. I don't think like the families in other parts of the world stay together. And in the US, there's such a focus on independence as a metric of success. But I think parents want to be taken care of in old age, especially. And your parents aren't old yet.
I mean, but that's also a factor too. Like I love my parents and I love spending time with them, and they're 63 and like 58. So it's like they don't have that much time left. So I don't know. It's just kind of a weird.
That's right. You hear that, Mr. and Mrs. Bacher? You've got one foot in the grave, too, apparently.
No, I think that's a really good one, though.
Very interesting. Yeah, I love my kids, but I don't know if I want them to move back in with me,
really?
though. Yeah. But
no, I feel like that was, it just depends. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think if you think about sharing walls, like my parents right now have a house with 3 extra bedrooms because they always had a room for my brother and I and a spare bedroom.
Yeah.
And they're not going to fill those rooms with other people. And then if I move into another house, that's another house. That's more space.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That's huge.
Yep. Absolutely.
Right.
So what have you got for us, Caitlin?
I just realized that I talked about food last week and I'm going to talk about food again this week, but
Caitlin likes food.
I really like food. I would encourage everyone to look into restaurants that serve local food, because yesterday I found a bakery in Colorado Springs that gets all of their grains from small local farms, and I didn't even know that was possible in Colorado, but it was the best bread that I've had in such a long time. And I like the idea of knowing your baker and knowing where your food comes from, and also having the food quality increase. And it wasn't that expensive either. I think it's going to last me the whole week.
Well done. So on the food subject, mine is food related too. And I think mine could be that I drive the grocery store clerks crazy, because I do buy some of my food at the grocery store. Most of us have to go to the grocery store for something. And so just this morning I was grocery shopping, and I do what I always do. I just cannot bring myself to, you have a roll of plastic bags in the produce department. You're going to get a couple of apples. You're supposed to get a plastic bag and put them in a plastic bag. Mm-hmm. I hate using that plastic. I think that plastic needs to be left as oil left in the ground. And I always carry in a canvas shopping bag. I think that might have been one of my lightening the load things. And I think we talked about recycling plastic grocery bags. But I have this thing, I have a hang up about putting my produce in plastic bags. So I don't. So I just put it in the cart, and when I get to the check stand, I just put it on the conveyor belt. And you might say, who knows who's been touching that conveyor belt and everything? Well, I'm going to be rinsing all my produce
and you touch
anyway.
Things all day, every day, and then you touch your hands to your face and your mouth. I just think you're under an illusion.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more trouble for the grocery store clerk, who has to kind of herd my 3 apples onto the scale instead of just grabbing a plastic bag. But then it all goes into my canvas bag, and I bring it home, and that's that. So that's my contribution to future generations, leaving that oil in the ground.
Nice.
All right. Last episode, we did talk a little bit about incentivizing smaller families and the ethics of, let's say, doing away with the child tax credit or dependent exemptions on taxes. We were kind of talking about that. And I think, Caitlin, you and I disagreed a little bit about whether that was considered coercive or not if we were taking that away. So I wanted to revisit that, and I started doing some of the research on that, but didn't finish. So I think I'll promise people that we're going to revisit that subject and have a really interesting conversation about that in the next edition of the Growth Busters podcast. So don't miss it. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a review. And we welcome your comments, your suggestions, your questions. And if you think about it, head over to conversationearth.org for more enlightenment, and help us get season 3 on the books with tinyurl.com/CE season 3. And that's the number 3. Find an episode to adopt.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. calling, 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 calling.